one thing to say right up front, there is no such thing as the Carbone method. I can tell you that right now. It doesn't exist. I don't know, people have used that term. As a matter of fact, it showed up at ABBA on a slide during a VB presentation. I about died when I saw that. The last thing I want to do is be associated with some approach or some new kind of, this is just the science of applied behavior analysis and the principles, and we're talking about how to bring them together in a conceptual sort of way so that people come away with just not another approach to ABA, so to speak, but come away with a conceptual analysis of the science in which these principles are merely part of it. And every science evolves and gets better and understands how its pieces systematically and conceptually fit together. And that's all we're trying to do. Some of the topics on errorless teaching, short inter-trial intervals, fast-paced instruction. None of that is my stuff. That's this body of literature. What we're trying to do is take this science and pull the pieces together and see how they relate to one another in a conceptual and a systematic sort of way. So what you'll see is the science and a clinical approach to applying those principles, but it certainly has nothing to do with some new method or some new discovery or something that deserves somebody's name on it or anything like that. So I think that's going to be an important, I think that whole issue of what's ABA, what's discrete trial, how are they different, those kind of issues, I think they're important ones to talk about. And I'll certainly do that. And in terms of the little bit of background and history, as you know, everything we talk about in terms of applied behavior analysis ultimately came from Skinner's work. He wrote a book in 1938 called The Behavior of Organisms, which is really a very interesting title when it was a sample of behavior of a small number of rats. Okay, not that rats have been unimportant in our science, as you may well know. In fact, Skinner was on the cover of Time many years ago with his head in the body of a rat, and you may have seen that, which was a particularly denigrating sort of way to describe his work. In any case, in 1938, he published a book called The Behavior of Organism, which was basically his treatise on the science of studying behavior. Okay? The most important thing he developed in that particular book was the distinction between operant conditioning and respondent conditioning. He basically showed how stimuli that precede behavior and stimuli that come after behavior affect and change and alter the frequency, rate, other dimensions of behavior. So he showed us that operant conditioning was in fact a process. Everything we talk about in terms of consequences, stimulus control, antecedents, all that, all came from that 1938 description using several rats as examples and cumulative records to describe our science. That was the first major contribution of that book, was we now had something called operant conditioning. We now had a way to look at consequences and learning, antecedents and consequences, and we now had a way of looking at learning. Everything that followed in terms of discrete trial came from that particular description of what we now call operant conditioning. Behavior operates on the environment and changes it, and as a result is changed itself by its operation. The whole notion of consequences and what we now call SDs, first description of discriminative stimuli, SDs, was in that 1938 book by Skinner, where he talked about the behavior of organisms. So that's where that term SD came from. Lobos certainly didn't make it up, and it doesn't mean something different within discrete trial than it did within Skinner's analysis. This all came from the science. That's where these words came from. Reinforcer, negative reinforcer, punishers, and all those principles all came from that 1938 discussion. He took a lot of basic research, including Pavlov's and Sherrington's and a whole bunch of people, and pulled it together in his laboratory at Harvard and wrote a book called The Behavior of Organism that outlined it. The second important thing that he did in that book, and maybe his greatest contribution, was he outlined the philosophy of how you go about studying behavior. He outlined what we now call the experimental analysis of behavior. You know, all those single subject design things that you see in Java, And the way in which we go about doing science, we don't use statistical analysis. He said it's better to look at 1 rat for 1,000 hours than 1,000 rats for 1 hour. We don't use large groups. We use an inductive process where we just go in and play around a little bit and try to figure things out. That whole philosophy of science was outlined in that particular book in 1938. How he went about discovering the principles of reinforcement, stimulus control, extinction, he then outlined as that's the way you ought to work with children. Now, he didn't say that in that book, but that was the implication. You ought to let the child teach you about what the child needs and what you need to do. And that your interaction ought to be a dynamic, ongoing process between you and the child, and not some recipe over here that you've decided ahead of time to follow. Very important point, which goes to the point of how to teach children with autism. It must be a dynamic process. You're constantly changing based upon the child, rather than saying, well, he's supposed to follow these recipes. Here's my prompt level. Guess he doesn't know what my prompt level is. Guess he doesn't care either. Well, I'm not changing my prompt level because over here in the recipe it said that's the prompt level you go next, and I'm the third therapist coming in today. If Skinner would have done any of that in trying to discover what we know, we wouldn't know what we know. That isn't going to work. He just said, hey, rat and pigeon, tell me about yourself. And the laws of nature will be discovered by our interaction. And that's what he discovered. He discovered laws of nature. Consequences, increase the frequency, the rate, some dimension of behavior, stimuli that come before it, control it. He discovered the laws of nature much the way Newton did, and others, through observation and ultimately experimentation. But he said, if you're going to experiment and you're going to teach, do it this way. Don't have a hypothesis that you then test. Just know the principles and go and play around and see what happens. And adjust based upon all the principles we now know. And that's how so that analysis, called the experimental analysis behavior, was the second thing that came out of that book. I mean, there were many other things. And I really urge people to read that book. Go right back to the original source and take a look at it. He changed many of his ideas over the years in that, but the basic stuff is still there. 2 issues. How to do science, which really is how to teach. The teacher should be a scientist, is the way we look at it. A strategic scientist. That's what Doug Greer calls. Teacher as a strategic scientist. You ought to be a scientist, moment to moment, being influenced by the child, number 1. So that's what he told us on how to do experimentation. And he told us about operant conditioning. With the publication of that book, and by the way, many of you may know that Skinner really had a desire to be an author. He wanted to write the great American novel, as a matter of fact. He went to Hamilton College in New York, graduated with a degree in literature, went on to the Village in New York City for several years and found out that he had nothing to say that anybody would buy. So unfortunately, he had to give that up. Got interested in reading some stuff and some of Bourne's work up at Harvard, and went on up to Harvard to get his degree. He was a dilettante. He was an inventor. He played around with machinery. Most of the first operant chamber was in fact made in his garage and in his basement. He played around with all this stuff. Very interesting guy who had and used all of these inventions, if you will, to tell us about behavior. Well, he published a book in 38. At the same time, Fred Keller was with him had been with him at Harvard as well. Keller went on to Columbia and began setting up a behavioral lab at Columbia. Several other students came from Keller and Nick Schoenfeld at Columbia University. In addition, Skinner was now publishing a lot of research and was now generating graduate students, so to speak, at Harvard, who were now looking at this experimental analysis of behavior. In the 50s, actually late 40s, early 50s, several people became particularly interested, mostly due to Keller's work at Columbia, in applying this science to human learning problems, to applied problems. And in the 50s, Keller began to generate graduate students who were interested in that. Keller started to talk about it. And people were now discovering more and more of the principles and deciding to apply those to human sort of problems. One of the first articles published in that regard was the Psychiatric Nurse article. Psychiatric Nurse as a Behavioral Engineer by Ione and Jack Michael in 1959. A classic article that I think people with a background in behavior analysis should read some of those early sort of studies in which the application of these principles were being applied. In 1945, Skinner wrote an article called The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms, and in that article he talked about radical behaviorism. Now, radical doesn't mean exactly extreme, although it certainly is. The idea that verbal behavior and feelings and emotions and beliefs and intentions could all be analyzed behaviorally. That we don't need to go outside of our science to analyze those, that the cognitive psychologists and others don't really have a market on that stuff, that stuff isn't unexplained behavior or unexplained phenomena inside of us. It's more behavior to be explained. It doesn't explain behavior, it's more behavior to be explained. So he said the human being and the human condition is one in which operant conditioning inside the skin and outside the skin, and what you see and what you don't see is all of the same matter, and consequences and environmental events are very important. Very important article that really kind of set the stage for a number of things. It set the stage for his publication of his book, Verbal Behavior in 1957. In the meantime, in 1953, he published a book called Science and Human Behavior. That particular book was used as an intro text. I highly recommend it for people. Science and Human Behavior. He published it with Macmillan Press, who agreed to publish it with no royalties going to Skinner, because he bartered with them to get Walden II published, his novel, The Great American Novel. He still wanted that novel. And Walden II in 1948, 47, 48, I think it was 48. In 1948 was his Great American Novel that Macmillan was only willing to publish if he wrote a intro text in psychology, which he published in 1953, called Science and Human Behavior, which is still a textbook that is used in most graduate programs in applied behavior analysis as the basis for an awful lot of what we talk about here. Okay? In addition, he then started to, over the past 20 years at this point, up to 1957, he was spending all of his time thinking about verbal behavior. He basically said, understanding why people say what they say and accounting for it is the most important thing we can study within the human condition and will be the most valuable analysis. Around 1957, a little bit earlier, a philosopher by the name of Whitehead, he was having a discussion with him, and Whitehead had said to him, I don't understand how you could possibly account for my verbal behavior using a natural science approach. Remember, most of the research up to 57 had been done with rats and pigeons and had shown nice smooth curves, that these principles must be working. We were now starting to apply it to important human problems in the 50s and the late 50s. So there wasn't a lot of support necessarily for this science being able to be easily applied to human learning, although Skinner was convinced, and so were others who were studying. It's the only the real reason for it. Well, Whitehead said to him during one meeting, how could you account for the fact that I just said there's no black scorpion falling on this table? And he said, now, I've never said that before in my life. You account for my verbal behavior, Dr. Skinner. And basically Skinner said, it would take me hours to account for it. Let me write a book instead. And that's what he did. That was the reason why, one of the impetus for writing. The antecedent directly before was Whitehead's comments on you can't possibly account for it. He said, I can account for it, but it would take, let me write a book on it. He took 20 years of notes, actually longer, more than 20 years of notes, and from those notes he had them categorized in his basement in different file folders, and each chapter came out of the notes. He'd pull out the notes, and he had categorized 20 years of notes. He'd pull them out, and he'd write a chapter on the tact, on the man, on the introverbal, and he wrote the book in 57. The book is very difficult to read, okay? It is very hard to read. For a couple of reasons. That is a very complex topic, language. I read the book about 3 times a year. I've taken many courses by Jack Michael and Scott Wood directly, teaching the courses with study guides, and I'm not sure I got everything he was talking about. And people continue to study it. It's a very difficult book to read. Why? First of all, you have to know at least 3 things very, very well. First of all, you have to know behavior analysis very, very well to understand the book, because he doesn't spend a lot of time defining terms. You have to know behavior analysis very, very well. The second thing is you have to know the psycholinguistic approaches at the time that he's constantly criticizing, so that you understand what he's talking about and why verbal behavior is replaced by, verbal behavior replaces that. So you've got to know that, number two. And number three, you've got to know a lot about Gertrude Stein, because he spends an awful lot of time making references to literature and Gertrude Stein throughout the book, because towards the end of the book you can see he starts to go into his literature background and uses examples from literature, and particularly Gertrude Stein, to explain her verbal behavior or other people's verbal behavior. It's a very interesting sort of notion the way he does that, and it becomes very, very difficult to read. So for those three reasons, most people are put to sleep almost immediately by the book. Should you need a soporific drug, I recommend it. It will put you to sleep almost immediately. However, I do, with that having been said, I encourage you to read the book. Well, the book was published in, yeah, there's an endorsement, right? Okay. With the publication of the book in 57, there was almost no recognition of it until Noam Chomsky in 1959 wrote a scathing review of the book and published it in the flagship journal Language, which is still the journal, one of the most prestigious journals in the field of language therapy and language teaching, the journal Language. And as a result of that scathing review, which Skinner was convinced that Chomsky either didn't read the book or clearly didn't understand it, Skinner failed to ever respond to that. He never responded to Chomsky's review. Chomsky's review said that couldn't possibly be an accurate account of verbal behavior, that those principles can't possibly apply. It has to be a native, self-generative, inherited, innate tendency to speak, and that the structures of language are embedded in the brains of people, and the rules that those structures generate are in fact innate and part of every human being, which makes us different from lower organisms. That's oversimplification. Chomsky changed many times over the years as well. He changed his opinion on those sort of things. If you're interested in this topic, and I think it's a very interesting one, the current issue of the analysis of verbal behavior, which is a journal I'm going to talk a little bit about, has recently published, volume 17, has published the papers of Owen Ploss and Noam Chomsky writing back and forth in an argument about verbal behavior versus Chomsky's approach to linguistics and psycholinguistics. Okay? So it's a very interesting article. In there also is an article by Dave Palmer from Smith College on Chomsky's review of Skinner, in which Dave Palmer criticizes Chomsky's review and says, here's where Chomsky was wrong. Yeah. As you may know, that journal does not have a large readership. And unfortunately, 140. Me and 139 other people subscribe to it. We're actually going to give away, in the hope that you will continue. We're going to do, you signed for, we're going to give away about 5 of them, I think, right? We're going to do a raffle drawing. We're buying them. We're hoping that once you get the journal in your hand. Also, if you want to buy the journal, we'll take your money. Goes without saying. We'll take your money and we will mail it in for you. We have the registration forms for the journal. $180 will get you all 16 volumes, and then you'll have to buy 17 on your own. $180 for the entire set, going all the way back to 1982. I'll tell you more about what that journal is. We highly recommend that you purchase that journal and use it as part of your library and part of your resources in teaching children with autism. In any case, Chomsky wrote a scathing review. Skinner didn't respond to it. Corkadale did in about 1970. In any case, as a result of that book, a fellow by the name of Jack Michael, Dr. Jack Michael, had finished up his PhD in 1955 at UCLA, and he picked up the book and picked up Skinner's works, was not trained as a behavior analyst, and said basically, boy, this is fascinating stuff. I think we ought to start doing it. Jack was then teaching at Kansas and the University of Houston. He then went on in 1967 to Western Michigan University, where there is now probably one of the best known behavior analysis programs in the country. It's turned out dozens and dozens of very prolific writing students and wonderful behavior analysts who have trained many of them. I was trained by Scott Wood, who was one of Jack's students. In any case, Jack Michael began using Skinner's textbook, Verbal Behavior, as a textbook, as a course for his students. Okay? One of his students in particular, Mark Sundberg, had a great interest in it. And during the 1970s, at Western Michigan University, after Jack having picked that up, in the 1970s, a lot of research was being generated, not much of it, some of it published, most of it published in dissertation abstracts, but a lot of research being published on Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior applied to people with autism and developmental disabilities. That was in the 70s at Western Michigan University. Now you have to know, let's start to get these tracks going. You got Jack Michael. You know that idea of being six, what was from Kevin Bacon? Yeah, 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon. You know, everybody who's doing verbal behavior stuff is 6 degrees from Jack Michael. Okay, we're all related in some way. We were trained by somebody who was trained by somebody. We're all it's kind of a web that's come out of that. In the 60s, as you well know, the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was now published, given Skinner's work in '38 and all the other works that have come along. We now had a journal that would publish research on applied behavior analysis in the 60s. Well, prior to that, and pretty much since the earth cooled, Lobos has been at UCLA, okay? He was doing an enormous amount of work with children with autism and related disabilities at UCLA, and was turning out a number of graduate students. You got to remember that Lobos was not trained as a behavior analyst either. He got his training from Sid Bijou up at the the experimental education unit up in Washington, which is now still in practice, in fact, still operating. He came back to UCLA, set up a program, and began doing an awful lot of work with children with autism. Many of the videotapes and the materials that you've seen, those old kind of craftly sort of stuff, was all done during that particular era at UCLA. So Lobos, to his credit, was one of the few people who was interested in children with autism when it was not popular to be interested in children with autism. He was that was right on the heels of the Bruno Bettelheim stuff. You know, The Empty Fortress. It was Mom's Fault. And, you know, right on the heels of that stuff in the 40s and 50s, Lobos was saying, there may be some learning problems here that we need to look at, and that may be the source of these problems, and not this kind of psychodynamic relationship between mother and child. It may be a learning sort of problem. So Lobos started doing a bunch of work there, publishing a number of articles and a number of research papers, most of it published outside the behavioral literature, because there was no behavioral literature in the early 60s. The Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis comes on board in 1968, and now Lobos and his students throughout the late 60s, throughout the 60s, the late 60s, and into the 70s, flood the literature with the analysis of discrete trial training. He took Skinner's 3-term contingency, antecedent, behavior, and consequence, which is a discrete trial, and basically said, let's apply what Skinner told us in 1938 about antecedent control, responses, behavior, and consequences, and based on operant conditioning, which Skinner explained to us in 1938, he said, let's take that model of what Skinner said and start to apply it to the learning needs of children with autism, with language, with socialization, with play, with all the skills, with problem behavior. Let's apply that 3-term contingency, antecedent behavior. That's what he talked about when he talked about a discrete trial. What he basically discovered through his literature, through his research, and then published in the literature, was that kind of breaking down these kind of learning units, if you will, into these discrete trials and teaching these things and building them produces pretty darn good gains in children with autism, using Skinner's analysis of reinforcement, stimulus control, and so on. And he began discovering the teaching methods that were most effective with children with autism. All that literature is published throughout the 70s into the 80s. What's also going on a separate track, if you will, what's going on a separate track is Mark Sundberg's work and Jack Michael's work in the 70s on the analysis of verbal behavior using all of discrete trial training information that's coming out as well, and using the science of applied behavior analysis that came from Skinner that's now being published and so on. So if you want to look at discrete trial training, it's an outgrowth of a set of teaching procedures based upon the science of applied behavior analysis. It's not a separate entity. It's not something different from it. It's a set of procedures that's consistent with the scientific evidence that says if you teach in certain ways, and what Lobos found is if you teach in these very specific sort of ways, you get even better outcome based upon these principles. So what he did was show the clinical application of these principles to children with autism and other disabilities and learning problems, and we can get good results. So it extended the principles to repertoires and behavior of certain children within our science. Well, that's going on in the 70s. Mark Sundberg is doing similar sort of things, and others at Western Michigan between about 1972 and 1980. He's doing similar sort of things at the Multi-Handicap Center in Kalamazoo, Michigan. But what he's doing in addition to what Lobos has suggested is that he's using Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior to teach language. He's saying we shouldn't just use all these principles that Lobos has told. We ought to also use Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, since Jack Michael was there. What he did was he would go with Mark over to the multi-handicap and said, let's try man, let's try a cat. They started to play around with Skinner's terms out of the book. He said, let's take a man, let's take a cat, let's take an introverbal, and let's play around with people who are non-vocal to see if these principles, I mean, if you do it with vocal people, it's hard to control. They've already got an enormous repertoire. Let's see if with non-vocal people, we can get this to occur. What did they start with? That's why they started with sign language. They started doing that quite a bit with sign language to see if Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior actually held up, that there were these different categories, which we're going to talk about. And what did they find? That it absolutely did. They published many manuscripts and many dissertations. And Mark Sundberg ultimately published his dissertation on the use of sign language. So this ABA kind of research, if you will, that Lobos is telling us about is going on through the 70s and 80s. What's happening also through the 70s and 80s is that body of literature being applied at Western Michigan and other places, and Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. What has been ignored to some degree in discrete trial training programs, or the application of applied behavior analysis that's come to be called discrete trial training, has been Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. It has not been a mainstay, or has not been a part of that analysis. What has developed through the 70s and 80s in the discrete trial literature is an ignoring of the functional categories of verbal behavior to some degree by most of the people. In other words, not differentiating a request from a label, from an answer to a WH question. A word is a word is a word in that literature. And that's why so much emphasis is placed upon vocal imitation, or the structure of language, getting the topographies, the forms, but kind of missing the idea that those forms are not of much value unless they occur spontaneously, and that's what we call a man. So getting somebody to imitate words may not be of a lot of value unless, under conditions of strong motivation, they also say those words first. You see how the discrete trial, because they ignored the fact that there's this motivational condition that evokes the word coffee when I want some, just getting somebody to say coffee may not be as valuable as getting somebody to say coffee when they want some. So the discrete trial people, by ignoring Skinner's analysis, ignored the function of language in favor of the structure of language. And you notice when people talk about sometimes in discrete trial training programs that you've got this kind of robotic sounding scripted stuff, that's what happens when emphasis is placed on structure instead of function. Function brings prosody. Function brings naturalness, so to speak. Structure brings structure. What you get is a sentence, I want cookie, please. I would like some of that. If you emphasize structure and not function, you tend to get structure that doesn't sound like function. Doesn't sound the same. And because topographies are shaped differently under functional conditions than they are in structure. So the analysis has been that a lot of the discrete trial training programs have looked at structure, getting words, getting lists of words, getting vocabulary, getting the child to know a lot, being able to label a lot of things, but then they don't ever say those words other places, or they don't start conversations with people. What Mark Sundberg was working on with Skinner's analysis said is that there is function within that structure. you need both. You need structure and you need function. And that analysis is what Mark was studying. Beginning in 1982, Mark Sundberg began to publish the book, the journal, The Analysis of Verbal Behavior, in which discrete trial training, or ABA procedures based upon our science, were being applied to persons with developmental disabilities, conceptual articles, but also in the context of that Skinner's Analysis of Verbal Behavior. That journal is dedicated exclusively to discussions and research articles of Skinner's Analysis of Verbal Behavior. It's been published since 1982. It still has only 140 readers, and we're trying to change that. Isn't that a sad number? That's just all. I went to the special interest group meeting at ABA here recently. There was 30 of us in the room. I mean, it just, although there's more and more people becoming interested, sort of like yourselves, and which is good. You can be part of the cult. This kind of. It was interesting how in the 70s, if you were a behavior analyst, you used to kind of not tell people you were. Any of those of you old enough to remember, you would have a secret handshake, a kind of secret, because people wanted no part of us. What were they afraid of? They were afraid we were going to turn their kids into robots, that we were going to do mind control, that kind of stuff. It's kind of interesting how, in one generation, if you will, it's now become popular to be a behavior analyst. I like to say I was a behavior analyst when behavior analysis wasn't cool. There's got to be some kind of song there. We can put some music to those words, I'm sure. But in the 80s, Mark began to publish that journal. And that journal has now been published continuously for about 17 or 18 years or so. It is available, like I said, for $180. That journal is the empirical basis, and the research within that, and the analysis is the empirical basis of most of what I'm going to talk about over these 3 days. That's where that body of literature comes from. And none of that would have been realized without the publication in 1987 of Lovas's, now referred to as recovery or normalization article, in which enormous amount of interest in applied behavior analysis began. And that's why the idea of discrete trial and ABA have been used interchangeably. And it's almost as though applied behavior analysis is, okay, let's get a drill book, let's sit here, and what ABA is, because it's become popularized, is this kind of get a drill book, run these drills using SD1, SD2, and maybe with no recognition of what an SD really is, going back to Skinner's 1938 on what a discriminative stimulus is, and how it's different from a listening stimulus versus an evocative stimulus. Without any recognition of that, many people have taken that, and some people have taken and used that sort of notion of discrete trial without the conceptual analysis of applied behavior analysis. And as I like to say, some people who can barely spell ABA are now ABA specialists. I mean, everybody in the world is now an ABA specialist. Why? It's because there's a market for it, and it's marketable. I've even seen people write on business cards CBA and suggest that and then you say, well, I didn't think you'd been board certified yet. No, it means consulting behavior analyst. I mean, those kinds of things have monetary and economic implications. Certainly none of us are motivated by economics and monetary implications. But in any case, you start to see that sort of thing. So what happened with the publication of that article, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to the field, and the best thing that ever happened for behavior analysis, with the publication of that, many people have become specialists without the background credentials and the understanding of the field, and as a result, some rather poor forms of applied behavior analysis and discrete trial have kind of emerged in everyday life, and many parents, unfortunately, have spent an awful lot of money on some things that may not, in fact, be the most effective method. But always with the implication that this is what Lovas must have done to produce recovery. It's not usually said, but it's usually implied in the description by people. This is what Lovas must have done, and parents will, if that's it, then I want it. But that whole notion of discrete trial, to some degree, has become somewhat of a recipe sort of approach to our science and has lacked, we think, the conceptual analysis of the principles, number one, and number two, has ignored Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior in favor of a structured approach. So we've got these two kind of areas kind of coming together as a result of Logos' publication. Catherine Maurice writes her book in the early 90s, and everybody is very interested in applied behavior analysis, when prior to that we wouldn't even tell people we were behavior analysts for fear they wouldn't want any part of it. Suddenly we've become very, very popular. I think that's how the two have come together. Since the early 90s, and with the publication of Mark and Jim's book, Mark Sundberg, Jim Partington's book, and with other workshops and other materials that are getting out, I think what's happened is a blending of the scientific principles, the conceptual analysis, and Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior has now had an opportunity to be applied. And I think what it has done is filled a void related to communication in many people's programs, in which communication may not have been the major focus beyond some receptive language, may not have been the focus, and therefore you may have been less than satisfied with the ultimate outcome because the communication component of it hasn't been strong, or as strong as you'd like to see. And Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior has generated quite a bit of interest about how to fill the void in teaching children with autism that the discrete trial literature has virtually ignored, and has ignored the pragmatic functional approach to life. Now, have many children developed language with that structural approach? Yeah, they have. They certainly have. What could they have done with a more functional approach is the other issue, and how much more quickly might it have occurred? And what about the group of children that haven't developed functional communication? They may be teaching problems as opposed to incapable of learning functional communication. That there may be a large group of children that have gone unserved because of the structural approach, and some kids, despite the structural approach, may have done particularly well. To just give you a quick insight into the difference between structural and functional, running vocal imitation drills to get words and sounds as opposed to spending most of your time getting your child to request things. That's functional stuff. The structural approach may develop some sounds and words, not without the screaming that comes with the dreaded VI drills. You all know the dreaded VI drill. I mean, when those kids see the vocal imitation drill coming, that's when you start to see some of the most unusual problem behavior. Getting kids to ask for things they want doesn't produce that effect, but produces better language, more. That's the kind of difference. And you might not see that difference between getting the child to imitate sounds and words and then saying, and I hope he now uses them, compared to spending most of your time contriving motivation to get kids to ask for things. You may not see the distinction between those two unless you understand Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. His analysis guides you away from the structural and towards the functional, and that's what it's added to our analysis. And maybe some kids have learned with the structural approach. You know, most people in this room didn't learn to speak through structural teaching. You learned to speak functionally. You learned to ask for things. You learned to talk about things. Nobody spent a lot of time getting you to say the words just right and then assuming that once you could say them right and label a bunch of stuff, then you would use it. Nobody made that assumption. It developed naturally to a functional approach. When it doesn't develop naturally, it's very interesting how we go back to a structural approach of trying to get words without their meaning, so to speak. We need to look at words, and we need to look at words taught within the context of their meaning, rather than words taught as words said, or under very restricted meaning. What is it? What is a very restricted meaning of the word table? When I show you a picture of a table and say, what is it? You say table. That is a very restricted understanding, if you will, of the word table. We need a broader understanding of the word table, and that won't come from sitting at a table in most cases early on, being drilled and getting vocabulary words. There's no reason to think it will be used. He can say candy. How come he doesn't ask for it? kind of interesting. He can label it, but he never asks, but he screams instead when he wants candy. He knows the word. He must have a cognitive problem that doesn't allow him to make the association. It may be a teaching problem in which the environment hasn't been arranged properly to differentiate between a request and a label. It'll come as no surprise to you once you do this analysis why labeling doesn't transfer to requesting or answering WH questions. But the distinctions across those categories, if not addressed, would lead you to believe it's a learner problem and not a teaching problem. As soon as we look at Skinner's analysis, we start to see what the teaching procedures might be to make that happen. And now we're not so much worried about his cognitive problem, we're worried about how good are we at teaching. Now that's a better problem. Now not one many therapists like to suggest is the reason why somebody may not be talking. But until the analysis, and there are learner variables, clearly, but until the analysis is brought out, that may be the case. That's what Skinner's analysis did and added to applied behavior analysis in discrete trial. On top of it, what we have tried to do is use Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, turn the teacher into a scientist and not a recipe follower. Turn the teacher into a scientist who responds more based on Skinner's notion of science being an inductive process and a dynamic process from 1938. Turn the teacher into a scientist who understands the concept and the principle, who uses Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, which we'll go into in much greater detail during their teaching, and then brings to bear what we have learned about instruction in terms of pace of instruction, the errorless nature of instruction, the short, what we call intertrial intervals, what the advantage of the literature as it grows says about mixing and varying rather than mass trialing. We're bringing to bear all the things that we're learning with Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior and the teacher as a scientist and not a recipe follower where I've got a book of drills, I got SD1, I got SD2, and I got prompt levels, here I go. And now you too can be an expert in applied behavior analysis. Give me a book, give me a couple of SDs and a few prompt levels and I'm ready to go. When in fact, that notion of a dynamic relationship based upon the principles may be ignored, which may account to some degree for some of the lack of progress. The problem is that when those principles are ignored, the child gets designated as having the learning problem. And clearly children with autism do. And clearly they're very difficult to teach in many cases. But as soon as we keep it with the child, we lose the opportunity to find out the independent variables in the environment that may account for that lack of development and that lack of skill. And as soon as we do that, we close off the opportunity that there may be something in our science that can tell us how to better teach somebody. We attribute it to the child. It distracts us from the variables that may in fact be able to overcome what is a very difficult situation and somebody who's very hard to teach. So that's what we're bringing there. Skinner's analysis, teacher as a scientist, an inductive sort of process, and then everything we've learned over the years about instruction in terms of mixing and varying, errorless teaching, pace of instruction, and so on, bring it all to bear on what we call the analysis, applied behavior analysis or discrete child training. That's why it may look somewhat different in the videos that I'll be showing you. It's going to look different than maybe what you're used to seeing in terms of discrete child. It's not as though this is a different science. I'm reading a different literature. What we're trying to do is bring those principles, inductive, teacher as a scientist, the inductive nature of a dynamic process, Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, and all the recent advances in our field related to how you pace and present stimuli, how you pace and present information so as to avoid negative behavior problems and self-stimulatory behavior. Laying on top of that one more variable that has come to bear on this form of teaching is the development of the notion of an establishing operation or motivation. You may all be familiar with the Cable's work on pivotal response forms and pivotal behaviors, where they talk about motivation being a key issue. It absolutely is. Motivation is key to this whole thing. Jack Michael and then Mark Sundberg and others have developed an understanding of establishing operations. leads to the issue of motivation. That must be a concept that we're now bringing to bear on what people formerly called discrete child training to improve it. What you're going to see, I think, is a natural progression of the science. The issue of fluency being added to that analysis. Number of pieces of the field of behavior analysis that have not been brought together necessarily, we're trying to bring together and apply clinically to children with autism. A dynamic process, Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior teacher as a scientist, the update on the teaching procedures, and then finally the use of Jack Michael's analysis of the establishing operation to understand teaching interactions. Okay? I say all that to tell you that's why what you see is not outside of our science, is not something other than ABA, but we think is kind of an upgraded form of the principles that seem to govern the teaching of children with autism, and that this information can be very valuable in the hands of people who are properly trained and understand it and want to pursue it, can be very helpful in teaching children with autism. It's a natural progression of our science to this level. The problem is that there may not be that many strategic science, teachers who are strategic scientists. So that then becomes the goal of the teacher and becomes the desire of the training is to produce these kind of strategic scientists, if you will, people who dynamically respond from moment to moment. So what you see in the videos came from all of that stuff to where we are now, and the purpose of these 3 days is to kind of fill in the blanks of what does it mean to be a strategic scientist? What does it look like? What does somebody do who does that? What is Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior? How does it apply? And what are those teaching procedures that we now know about teaching that may in fact improve our teaching of children with autism? And what is this stuff about establishing operations and our understanding of shifting values of reinforcing? Those 4 elements that we've brought together to kind of describe what you see. And that's why for people not terribly familiar with the literature, and only somewhat familiar with the discrete child, you may say, where did that come from? I never heard of that stuff. Well, it's not that it doesn't exist within our science. It may be that if you have a restricted view of what ABA is in terms of SD1, SD2 prompt levels, and not sure what Skinner said about a discriminative stimulus in 1938, no less 1953, in the science of human behavior, it may look like something not part of our science, when in fact it's just an extension of what we already know, and a clinical application of it. One thing I'll say in this is you know that the way most sciences develop is that good basic applied work occurs, gets published, and then there's lags. There's lags in terms of clinical application. I think that's what you see. What we're trying to do is clinically apply what we already know. It is not a new method. It is not the Carbone method or something like that. It is the clinical application of a lot of pieces that have been out there that haven't been applied. Does it beg for an empirical analysis? Yeah, I think it does. And we're in the process of doing a little bit of that. But we also know an awful lot about these things already. We don't need another publication. For example, those of you that read Java, do you really need another article on functional assessment? I mean, do I need another article on functional assessment to tell me how to do it? If you look at the past 5 years in Java of functional assessment articles, they're almost all clinical applications in my opinion. They are not groundbreaking empirical research that says, I think I'll do something differently now. They're almost like clinical applications. Well, we don't need more clinical applications. We need to know about, but this is the forum for clinical applications, not journal space. Journal space is for basic empirical research that adds to what we already know. The clinical application comes from conferences, workshops, and on-the-job working with somebody being mentored. It doesn't come from, so I don't think we need another set of articles on the clinical application, unless you're at a university and need tenure, then it certainly is to your advantage to do so. And if you look at the university sites where most of those applications on functional assessment are coming from, they're driven to a large degree by university-based needs to publish, and maybe not because, oh, I can't wait to see another article on functional assessment. So same sort of thing. We think this clinical application should be taught to people like yourself through this, and we don't need another article showing exactly that. We think we know enough. And there's probably some teasing out of a few variables here that will be particularly interesting, but we don't think we need to say, well, have you ever tested that compared to SB1, SB2, Trump level? No, but I don't think we need to. Those who do may find it useful to do. Okay. Well, that's the background. That's the background information. Let me just, for a couple minutes, then we'll take a break. I just want to start, because what we're going to do most of the time from now on out is kind of look at videotapes of children and the kinds of things those kids are doing. But that's the basic background information. I spent some time on it because I think it's valuable to see where these tracks came from and how this science kind of developed and where we got to where we are, and that we're not just some renegade sort of group over here, just kind of out on the fringe. But this is as mainstream to the science as you can possibly get. In fact, it's so mainstream that the stuff that we're doing appeared in almost all the presentations at ABA related to verbal behavior. As this is the mainstream. And it's very interesting how the papers at ABA, with VB stuff, if you get 30 people in the room who are interested, and it's great, and the researchers are finding out that we're filling rooms like this almost every day, they're basically saying, what are we doing wrong? How come we can't get our own people interested, and the people who are applying it are much more interested in it than our own people? I spoke to 300 behavior analysts recently in Orlando, Florida. I asked them, how many of you read Skinner's book on verbal behavior? 5 hands went up. I asked them, how many of you teach language every day or communication every day? Almost every hand went up. I asked them, how many people have the analysis of verbal behavior, the journal? 4.5. One person's subscription had run out. Okay? So 4.5 hands went up. I used to have it. That's in our own field. I think the field of verbal behavior and applied behavior analysis, the way we're talking about, is growing from people's applications of it and is forcing others to think about how we go about getting our science out there. I mean, our science is of no value unless it's in the hands of the people in this room. I mean, another publication doesn't do anybody any good unless it reaches somebody who then uses it to make somebody's life better. That's the definition of applied. So we think we're moving in the right direction. This